I destroyed my best and perfect family after my husband caught me cheating on him with my boss and sent me to jail for having. From the outside looking in, my life appeared to be a picture-perfect example of suburban bliss. Our two-story house, with its neatly manicured lawn and white picket fence, was nestled in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. I had a loving husband, Tom, who worked as an engineer at a well-known tech company, and two wonderful children, our 10-year-old daughter, Lily, and our 8-year-old son, Max. I had a successful career as a marketing executive at a prominent firm. My boss, Richard, was well respected in the industry and a charismatic leader. I had always prided myself on my ability to balance work and family, juggling conference calls and PTA meetings with equal finesse. To the world, I was the epitome of a successful working mom. But beneath the surface, the cracks in my perfect facade were starting to show. The pressure to maintain this flawless image was immense. I often found myself staying late at the office working on projects that seemed to grow in complexity by the day. Richard had a way of pushing us to our limits, demanding excellence while offering little in the way of recognition or support. The stress was taking its toll on me, both physically and emotionally. I began to feel like a hamster on a wheel, running endlessly but getting nowhere. At home things were slipping too. Tom and I had once been inseparable, sharing everything from our hopes and dreams to our silly inside jokes. But as the years went by and our responsibilities grew, we started to drift apart. Our conversations became more transactional, centered around the logistics of running a household rather than the emotional connection that had once defined our relationship. "Did you pick up the dry cleaning?" Tom would ask, his eyes glued to his laptop. "Yes, and I also scheduled Mac's dentist appointment," I would reply, mentally ticking off another item from my never-ending to-do list. Even our intimate moments were few and far between, reduced to hurried, obligatory encounters that left me feeling more alone than ever. I missed the days when we would stay up late talking about our dreams for the future, the way Tom used to look at me with a mixture of love and admiration. Now it felt like we were just two ships passing in the night, our connection growing weaker with each passing day. The kids were my saving grace, their laughter and boundless energy providing a welcome respite from the stress of work and the emotional distance at home. Lily was a bright, imaginative child who loved to draw and write stories. She would often show me her latest creations, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she explained each character and plot twist. Max, on the other hand, was a bundle of energy, always eager to play sports or build elaborate Lego structures. Their innocent joy reminded me of the simpler, happier times in my life, and I clung to those moments like a lifeline. But even my relationship with the kids was starting to suffer. I found myself snapping at them more often, my patience worn thin by the constant demands of work and the underlying tension in my marriage. The guilt was overwhelming, but I didn't know how to break free from the cycle of stress and frustration that had become my daily reality. At work, Richard's presence loomed large. He was a man of great charisma and ambition, always pushing the boundaries of what was possible. His confidence was infectious, and it wasn't long before I found myself drawn to him, seeking his approval and validation in ways that went beyond the professional. Richard had a way of making me feel seen and appreciated, something that had been sorely lacking in my life for far too long. Our interactions started innocently enough: late-night brainstorming sessions, working lunches, and the occasional after-hours drink to unwind after a particularly grueling day. But as the weeks turned into months, the line between professional and personal began to blur. Richard would compliment my work, his eyes lingering on mine just a little too long, his touch lingering a little too intimately. "Jane, you're truly exceptional," he said one evening after we had successfully landed a major client. "I don't know what I would do without you." His words sent a thrill down my spine, a stark contrast to the indifference I often felt at home. The rational part of me knew this was dangerous territory, but the emotional part of me, the part that craved recognition and affection, was powerless to resist. As the pressure at work mounted, so did the intensity of my feelings for Richard. It felt like a drug, an intoxicating escape from the monotony and stress of my everyday life. I started dressing a little nicer, spending a little more time on my hair and makeup, eager to catch his eye and earn his praise. Each compliment, each lingering glance, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. At home, Tom was oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. He was preoccupied with his own career and the demands of fatherhood, unaware of the emotional void that was growing between us. I knew I should talk to him to try and bridge the gap that had formed, but every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. It was easier to bury my feelings, to focus on the day-to-day tasks that kept our lives running smoothly. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I arrived home to find Tom sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. The kids were already in bed and the house was eerily quiet. "Hey," I said, trying to muster a smile. "How was your day?" Tom looked up, his eyes tired. "It was fine, just busy as usual. How about you?" "Same," I replied, my voice hollow. "Just the usual craziness." We lapsed into silence, the chasm between us feeling wider than ever. I wanted to reach out, to tell him how much I missed him, how lonely I felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and retreated to the living room, the weight of my unspoken feelings pressing down on me. As I sat there, staring at the TV, but not really watching, my phone buzzed with a message. It was Richard. "Great job today, Jane. I couldn't have done it without you." His words, simple as they were, filled me with a warmth that had been missing from my life for so long. I knew I was playing with fire, but in that moment, I didn't care. I needed to feel valued, to feel wanted, and Richard was giving me that in spades. I typed out a quick response, my heart pounding. "Thanks, Richard. It means a lot to hear that." As the days went by, Richard and I grew closer, our bond deepening with each shared secret and stolen glance. I knew it was wrong, that I was betraying the man who had stood by me through thick and thin, but the allure of Richard's attention was too powerful to resist. The illusion of perfection was crumbling, and I was too far gone to stop it. Little did I know the consequences of my actions would soon come crashing down around me, shattering the life I had worked so hard to build. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, a tangled web of desire and deceit that I couldn't seem to escape. Richard's attention had become my lifeline, a beacon of validation that made the drudgery of my daily life bearable. Every smile, every compliment, every lingering touch fueled the fire that burned within me, a fire that was quickly spiraling out of control. It started innocently enough, late nights at the office working on projects that seemed never-ending. Richard and I would stay long after everyone else had gone home, poring over marketing strategies and client pitches. Our conversations would drift from work to more personal topics, and before long the lines between professional and personal had completely blurred. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, Richard suggested we grab a drink at a nearby bar. I hesitated for a moment, the rational part of me screaming that this was a bad idea. But the allure of his company was too strong, and I found myself nodding in agreement. The bar was dimly lit, a cozy refuge from the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. We sat in a corner booth, the atmosphere intimate and charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. As we sipped our drinks, Richard leaned in closer, his gaze intense. "Jane, I have to say, you amaze me," he said, his voice low and sincere. "The way you handle everything, your creativity, your dedication, it's truly remarkable." His words sent a thrill through me, a rush of warmth that spread from my chest to my fingertips. "Thank you, Richard," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "That means a lot coming from you." He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "I mean it, Jane. You're an incredible woman." I knew I should pull my hand away, but I couldn't. The connection between us was too strong, the pull of his admiration too intoxicating. In that moment, all I could think about was how much I needed to feel wanted, to feel valued. As the night wore on, the tension between us grew, an unspoken understanding hanging in the air. When we finally left the bar, Richard walked me to my car, his hand lingering on my arm as he said goodnight. "Jane," he said softly, his eyes searching mine, "there's something between us, isn't there?" I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "Yes," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and demanding. I melted into him, the weight of my guilt and fear momentarily forgotten. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. From that night on, our affair escalated quickly. What had started as innocent flirtation soon turned into stolen moments and secret rendezvous. We would meet in his office after hours, the door locked and the blinds drawn. The thrill of the forbidden consumed me, making it easy to forget the consequences of my actions. At home, I did my best to maintain the facade of the perfect wife and mother, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Tom was busy with his own work, and the emotional distance between us continued to grow. I threw myself into my role as a mother, clinging to the moments with Lily and Max as a way to ground myself. One evening, as I was helping Lily with her homework, she looked up at me with a puzzled expression. "Mommy, why do you seem so sad lately?" Her question caught me off guard, and I forced a smile. "I'm not sad, sweetheart, just a little tired, that's all." But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. The truth was that I was caught in a web of my own making, and the weight of my deceit was becoming too much to bear. Richard and I continued our affair, the intensity of our feelings growing with each passing day. But the thrill of our secret encounters was slowly being overshadowed by a sense of dread. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around me. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, Richard pulled me aside. "Jane, we need to talk," he said, his expression serious. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What is it?" He glanced around to make sure we were alone before speaking. "Tom's been asking questions. He came by the office yesterday while you were out, and he seemed suspicious." Panic surged through me. "What did you tell him?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told him we were working late on a project, but I don't think he believed me. You need to be careful, Jane. He's getting suspicious." The fear of being caught was like a cold, sharp blade pressing against my throat. I nodded, my mind racing with ways to cover my tracks. "I'll be careful," I promised, though the words felt hollow. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed world was about to implode. The guilt and fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to end things with Richard. The thought of losing his admiration and the thrill of our affair was too painful to bear. When I arrived home, Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, his expression tense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice strained. My heart sank. "About what?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and suspicion. "About us, about what's been going on. You've been distant, Jane. You've been working late a lot, and I can't help but feel like there's something you're not telling me." I felt a wave of panic wash over me, my mind scrambling for a plausible explanation. "Tom, I've been under a lot of stress at work. Richard's been pushing us hard to meet deadlines, and it's been exhausting." He studied me, his expression unreadable. "Is that all it is? Work stress?" I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Yes, that's all it is." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I had no other choice. The truth would destroy everything, and I wasn't ready to face the consequences of my actions. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just want us to be okay, Jane. I miss you." His words cut through me, a painful reminder of what I was risking. "I miss you too," I said softly, the guilt nearly overwhelming me. We lapsed into silence, the chasm between us feeling wider than ever. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had formed, but I didn't know how. The secrets I was keeping had built walls between us that seemed insurmountable. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our home grew. Tom's suspicions hadn't dissipated, and I found myself walking on eggshells, constantly on edge. The thrill of my affair with Richard was now tainted by the fear of being discovered. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "We need to talk. Meet me at the office." I glanced at Tom, who was already asleep, and quietly slipped out of the house. The drive to the office was filled with a sense of foreboding, my heart pounding with each passing mile. When I arrived, Richard was waiting for me in his office, his expression grim. "Jane, we can't keep doing this. It's getting too dangerous." I felt a surge of panic. "What are you saying?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm saying we need to end this. It's not worth the risk anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "But I thought you cared about me." "I do care about you, Jane," he said softly. "But this affair is destroying us both. We need to end it before it ruins everything." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, the reality of his words sinking in. "I don't know if I can." "You have to," he said gently. "For your sake and mine." I nodded, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Okay, he'll end it." As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of loss and despair that was almost unbearable. Ending the affair with Richard was the right thing to do, but it felt like I was losing a part of myself. The validation and admiration he had given me had become an addiction, and now I was being forced to go cold turkey. The next morning I woke up feeling numb, the reality of my situation pressing down on me like a lead weight. I needed to find a way to repair the damage I had done, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But as I looked at Tom, still asleep beside me, I couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and anxiety. Richard and I had agreed to end our affair, but the emotional residue lingered. The thrill that had once filled my days was replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I did my best to focus on my family and work, but the specter of my betrayal loomed large, casting a shadow over every aspect of my life. Tom's suspicions hadn't abated. He watched me closely, his gaze filled with a mixture of hurt and mistrust. I could feel the distance between us growing, an invisible barrier that seemed impossible to breach. I knew I needed to come clean, to confess my mistakes and seek his forgiveness, but fear held me back. The fear of losing him, of destroying our family, was paralyzing. One evening, as I was helping Max with his homework, Tom came into the room, his expression tense. "Jane, can we talk?" he asked, his voice strained. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Sure. Let me just finish up here." Max looked up at me, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Is everything okay, Mommy?" I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "Everything's fine, sweetie. I'll be right back." I followed Tom into the living room, my stomach churning with anxiety. He gestured for me to sit down, and I did, my mind racing with possible explanations for his demeanor. "Jane, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low and serious, "and I want you to be honest with me." My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. "What is it, Tom?" He took a deep breath, his eyes searching mine. "Are you having an affair?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, my mind scrambling for a way out. But I knew deep down that the time for lies had passed. I had to face the consequences of my actions. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I was having an affair with Richard." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Tom's anger and hurt radiating off him, a palpable force that threatened to crush me. "How long?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. 6 months, I replied, my eyes filling with tears. "It started as work, but it became more." He stood up, pacing the room, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why, Jane? Why would you do this to us?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know, Tom. I was feeling so disconnected, so unappreciated. Richard made me feel wanted, valued. But it was a mistake, a terrible mistake." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed our family. How could you be so selfish?" His words cut through me like a knife. the weight of my guilt and shame almost unbearable. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant to hurt you. I love you and I love our family. Please, can we find a way to fix this?" He shook his head, his expression hardening. "I don't know if we can, Jane. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The realization of what I had done hit me with full force. I had betrayed the man I loved, shattered the trust that was the foundation of our marriage, and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. That night I slept in the guest room, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. The next morning, Tom was distant, his interactions with me cold and perfunctory. The kids sensed the tension, their worried glances a painful reminder of the impact my actions had on our family. I knew I needed to take responsibility, to do whatever it took to make things right. I reached out to a therapist, seeking help to understand my behavior and find a way to rebuild my marriage. Tom agreed to attend couples therapy with me, though his reluctance was clear. The sessions were difficult, filled with painful admissions and raw emotions. We talked about the reasons behind my affair, the disconnect that had grown between us, and the steps we needed to take to heal. It was a slow and arduous process, but I was determined to do whatever it took to regain Tom's trust and save our family. One evening, after a particularly intense therapy session, Tom and I sat on the porch, the cool night air a welcome relief from the tension inside. "Do you think we can ever get past this?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. I looked at him, my heart aching with regret. "I hope so, Tom. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you, and I want to make this work." He sighed, his expression softening slightly. "I love you too, Jane, but it's going to take time, a lot of time." I nodded, understanding the enormity of the task ahead. "I know, and I'm willing to put in the work. I want to be the wife and mother our family deserves." As the weeks turned into months, we slowly began to rebuild our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the pain and anger threatened to overwhelm us. But we kept pushing forward, determined to find a way back to each other. One day, as I was picking up the kids from school, I received a call from my boss. "Jane, we need to talk," he said, his tone serious. "Can you come to the office?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Sure, I'll be there in an hour." When I arrived, Richard was waiting for me in his office, his expression grim. "Jane, there's been an investigation into our company's finances. They've found some discrepancies, and your name has come up." Panic surged through me. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are accusations of embezzlement and fraud. They're saying you and I were involved." The room seemed to spin around me, the weight of his words crashing down like a ton of bricks. "But I didn't do anything wrong, Richard, I swear." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I know, Jane. But the evidence they've found, it doesn't look good." My mind raced, trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. "What are we going to do?" Richard shook his head, his expression one of defeat. "I don't know, but we need to get lawyers, and fast." The next few days were a blur of legal consultations and mounting anxiety. The accusations were serious, and the evidence seemed damning. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of my mistakes and the consequences threatening to pull me under. As the investigation continued, it became clear that my affair with Richard had put me in the crosshairs. The financial discrepancies were being tied to our relationship, and the implications were devastating. I faced the very real possibility of losing everything: my family, my career, and my freedom. One evening, as I sat in the living room, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard. "Jane, we need to talk. Meet me at the office." I knew I should refuse, that any further contact with him could worsen my situation. But desperation drove me, and I found myself heading to the office, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. When I arrived, Richard was waiting for me, his expression tense. "Jane, I've been talking to my lawyer. They're saying that if we cooperate, we might be able to reduce our sentences." I felt a surge of anger. Reduce our sentences? Richard, I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to pay for this? He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I know, Jane, but the evidence is stacked against us. We need to think about damage control. The realization of what he was saying hit me like a punch to the gut. Are you saying we should plead guilty? He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. I'm saying we need to consider all our options. I don't want to go to jail, Jane, and I don't want you to either. The weight of his words pressed down on me, the enormity of the situation almost too much to bear. I knew that cooperating might be our only chance, but the thought of admitting to something I hadn't done was unbearable. As I left the office that night, my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The life I had worked so hard to build was unraveling before my eyes, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning I woke up to find Tom sitting at the kitchen table, his expression grim. "Jane, we need to talk," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding. "What is it, Tom?" He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with hurt. "I know about the investigation. I know about the charges. How could you do this to us?" I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Tom, I didn't do anything wrong, I swear, but they're saying I was involved because of my affair with Richard." His expression hardened. "So not only did you cheat on me, but now you're facing criminal charges? How could you be so reckless?" The weight of his words crushed me, the realization of the damage I had done hitting me with full force. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant for any of this to happen." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Jane. I don't know if I can stand by you through this." The fear of losing him, of losing my family, was overwhelming. "Please, Tom, I'm begging you. I need you. The kids need you." He stood up, his expression resolute. "I need some time to think, Jane. I need to figure out what I'm going to do." As he walked away, I felt a sense of hopelessness settle over me. The consequences of my actions were finally catching up to me, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face them. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles and mounting tension at home. Tom remained distant, his interactions with me cold and strained. The kids sensed the turmoil, their worried glances a painful reminder of the impact my actions had on our family. As the trial date approached, I knew that my life was about to change forever. The decisions I had made, the lies I had told, were all coming back to haunt me, and no matter what happened, I knew that I had destroyed the best and perfect family I had ever known. The days leading up to the trial were filled with a relentless sense of dread. Every waking moment was consumed by thoughts of what was to come, how my actions had led me to this point, and how the consequences were about to unfold. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks of daily life, but it was impossible to escape the looming specter of the trial. Tom's demeanor grew increasingly distant. He was polite but cold, his interactions with me perfunctory and strained. The man who had once been my rock now felt like a stranger. I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that my betrayal had caused, and it tore me apart. Our children, Lily and Max, were also affected by the tension at home. They sensed that something was wrong, even if they didn't fully understand the details. Lily, always perceptive, would ask me if everything was okay. Her eyes filled with concern. Max, usually full of energy and laughter, became quieter and more withdrawn. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Lily looked at me with a serious expression. "Mom, why are you and Dad fighting all the time?" Her question caught me off guard, and I struggled to find the right words. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults go through tough times, but we both love you and Max very much, and we're doing our best to work things out." Max looked up from his plate, his eyes wide. "Are you and Dad getting a divorce?" The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Tom and I exchanged a glance, and I saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. "We don't know what's going to happen yet, Max," Tom said gently. "But no matter what, we'll always be here for you." After dinner, I retreated to the guest room where I had been sleeping since the affair was revealed. The silence of the house was suffocating, and I found myself replaying the events of the past few months over and over in my mind. The affair with Richard, the discovery, the legal battles, it all felt like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The trial began on a cold, gray morning. I dressed carefully, trying to project an air of confidence that I didn't feel. As I stood before the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The stress and guilt had taken their toll, leaving me looking worn and haggard. When I arrived at the courthouse, Richard was already there, flanked by his lawyers. He avoided my gaze, his expression hard and unreadable. We had once been so close, but now we were adversaries, each trying to navigate the treacherous waters of our shared predicament. The courtroom was filled with an air of solemnity, the gravity of the situation pressing down on everyone present. As the proceedings began, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The prosecutor laid out the charges against us, detailing the financial discrepancies and the evidence that had been gathered. Richard's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of him as a dedicated professional who had been manipulated and betrayed. It was a stark contrast to the Richard Wood had known, and I felt a surge of anger and betrayal. He was trying to save himself by throwing me under the bus. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. My lawyer had advised me to be honest and straightforward, to admit my mistakes, but also to make it clear that I had not engaged in any criminal activity. "Mrs. Dawson," the prosecutor began, "can you explain the nature of your relationship with Mr. Richards?" I felt my cheeks flush with shame. "Richard and I had an affair," I admitted, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake, and I deeply regret it." The prosecutor nodded, his expression stern. "And what about the financial discrepancies? Can you explain those?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. I was not involved in any embezzlement or fraud. I didn't know about the financial discrepancies until they were brought to my attention. The prosecutor pressed on, his questions relentless. He painted a picture of me as a willing participant in Richard's schemes, someone who had used her position of trust to further her own interests. The weight of his accusations was overwhelming, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. Tom was there, sitting in the back of the courtroom. I could feel his eyes on me, and I wondered what he was thinking. Was he hoping that I would be exonerated, or was he already convinced of my guilt? The uncertainty was unbearable. As the trial progressed, I felt increasingly isolated. Richard's testimony was damning, and the evidence presented by the prosecution seemed insurmountable. My lawyer did his best to defend me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. One day, during a recess, Tom approached me. His expression was a mixture of anger and sadness, and I braced myself for what he was about to say. "Jane," he began, his voice low and tense, "how could you let it come to this? How could you destroy everything we had?" Tears welled up in my eyes. "Tom, I never meant for any of this to happen. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I'm so sorry, but I didn't do what they're accusing me of. You have to believe me." He shook his head, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Jane. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The weight of his words crushed me, and I felt a deep sense of despair. The trial was tearing us apart, and I didn't know if our marriage could survive it. The trial continued for weeks, each day a relentless barrage of accusations and counter-arguments. I felt like I was being torn apart, my life dissected and scrutinized under the harsh light of the courtroom. The media had caught wind of the case, and reporters were constantly outside the courthouse, eager for any scraps of information. One day, as I was leaving the courthouse, a reporter approached me. "Mrs. Dawson, do you have any comment on the allegations against you?" I glanced at her, my mind racing. I knew that anything I said could be used against me, but I also felt a desperate need to defend myself. "I didn't do it," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm innocent." The reporter scribbled in her notebook, her eyes alight with interest. "And what about your relationship with Mr. Richards?" I hesitated, then nodded. We had an affair and I regret it deeply, but I didn't commit any crimes. The reporter thanked me and moved on, but I knew that my words would be twisted and taken out of context. The public was hungry for scandal, and my story was just the latest in a long line of sensational headlines. As the trial drew to a close, I felt a sense of inevitability. The evidence against me was overwhelming, and I knew that the jury's verdict would likely not be in my favor. I tried to prepare myself for the worst, but nothing could truly brace me for the reality of what was to come. The day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. I sat next to my lawyer, my heart pounding in my chest. The jury filed in, their expressions solemn. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed in my mind, a hammer blow that left me reeling. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I struggled to keep my composure. The judge announced my sentence, 5 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud. As I was led away in handcuffs, I glanced back at Tom. His expression was a mixture of sorrow and resignation, and I knew that our marriage was over. The life we had built together, the family we had created, was shattered beyond repair. The next few days were a blur of processing and paperwork. I was taken to the county jail, where I would await transfer to a state prison. The reality of my situation was sinking in, and I felt a sense of hopelessness that was almost unbearable. In my cell, I had plenty of time to reflect on my actions. The affair with Richard, the lies I had told, the betrayal of my family, all of it had led me to this point. I had destroyed everything I held dear, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive myself. One day, as I was sitting in my cell, a guard approached me. "You have a visitor," he said. I felt a flicker of hope. Could it be Tom, coming to offer some words of comfort or forgiveness? But when I entered the visitation room, I saw that it was Richard. He looked haggard and defeated, his eyes filled with regret. "Jane," he began, his voice trembling, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I looked at him, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sorrow, and regret. "Richard, it's too late for apologies. We've both lost everything." He nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know. I just needed you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." I sighed, the weight of our shared mistakes pressing down on me. "We can't change the past, Richard. We can only try to move forward." As he left, I felt a sense of finality. The chapter of my life that had included Richard was over, and now I had to face the consequences of my actions alone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to adjust to life in jail. It was a harsh and unforgiving environment, and I quickly learned to keep my head down and avoid drawing attention to myself. The days were long and monotonous, filled with a routine that left little room for hope. But even in the darkest moments, there were small glimmers of light. I began attending therapy sessions, trying to understand the reasons behind my actions and find a path to redemption. I also reached out to Tom and the kids, writing letters in the hope of rebuilding some semblance of a relationship. One day I received a response from Tom. His letter was brief, but filled with a sense of cautious hope. "Jane, I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were, but for the sake of our children, I'm willing to try to find a way to move forward. Take care of yourself." His words brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a start. I clung to that hope, determined to use my time in prison to become a better person and find a way to make amends for the pain I had caused. The road to redemption would be long and difficult, but I was ready to face it. I had destroyed my best and perfect family, but perhaps in time I could find a way to rebuild a new life, one built on honesty, integrity, and the lessons learned from my mistakes. The reality of life in jail settled in slowly, like a weight pressing down on me every day. The cold, sterile walls of my cell were a constant reminder of the life I'd lost. I spent my days in a haze of regret and fear, wondering how I had managed to destroy everything I held dear. But there was little time to dwell on my sorrow. The legal battle was far from over. Even though I had been sentenced, My lawyer informed me that the prosecution was continuing to build their case against Richard and me. More evidence had come to light, and it seemed that the charges against us could be expanded. My heart sank every time I thought about it. What more could they possibly pin on me? How much worse could things get? One afternoon, I was called into a meeting room to speak with my lawyer. The room was bleak, with harsh fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs, but it was the only place I could have a private conversation. When I saw the look on my lawyer's face, I knew the news wasn't good. "Jane," he began, his voice heavy, "we need to talk about the new developments in your case." I felt a lump form in my throat. "What's going on?" He sighed, opening a file and spreading out several documents on the table. "The prosecution has uncovered additional financial records that suggest a deeper level of involvement in the embezzlement scheme. They believe you were actively participating in falsifying documents and manipulating accounts." My stomach dropped. "But I wasn't. Richard handled all of that. I never touched any of the financial records." He nodded sympathetically. "I believe you, Jane. But the problem is, the evidence they've found makes it look like you were complicit. Your name is on several of the documents, and they found emails between you and Richard discussing some of these transactions." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. I didn't know what Richard was doing. I trusted him, and now I'm paying the price for that trust. "Unfortunately, the prosecution is using that trust against you," my lawyer said grimly. "They're arguing that you must have known what was happening, that there's no way you could have been ignorant of the scheme." I buried my face in my hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. It felt like every decision I had made in the past year had led me further down this dark path, and now there was no way out. "We have to prepare for the possibility of new charges," my lawyer continued. "They're talking about adding charges of conspiracy and wire fraud. If you're convicted, your sentence could be significantly extended." His words echoed in my mind, the implications sinking in slowly. I had already been sentenced to 5 years in prison, but if these new charges were brought against me, I could be looking at a decade or more behind bars. The thought was terrifying. How could I survive that? How could I ever hope to rebuild my life if I was stuck in prison for so long? "Is there anything we can do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Can't we fight this?" He looked at me with a mixture of pity and determination. "We're going to fight, Jane, but you need to be prepared for the worst. The prosecution is determined to make an example out of you and Richard. They want to show that white-collar crime won't be tolerated, and they're willing to use every piece of evidence they can find to do it." I nodded numbly, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to get through this and find a way to move on with my life." "We'll keep fighting," he assured me. "But you need to stay strong and keep your focus. There's still a chance we can negotiate a plea deal or reduce the charges, but it's going to be an uphill battle." The weeks that followed were some of the most stressful of my life. Every day brought new developments in the case, new pieces of evidence that seemed to tighten the noose around my neck. My lawyer worked tirelessly to build a defense, but the odds were stacked against us. One day, as I was sitting in my cell, a guard approached and told me I had a visitor. My heart leapt at the thought of seeing Tom or the kids, but when I entered the visitation room, I was surprised to see my sister Emily sitting there. We hadn't been particularly close in recent years, but seeing her brought a wave of emotion crashing over me. "Emily," I said, my voice thick with tears as I sat down across from her. She smiled weakly, her eyes filled with sadness. "Jane, I'm so sorry it took me so long to come." I shook my head, wiping away the tears that had already begun to fall. "You're here now. That's all that matters." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air between us. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "I've been keeping up with your case," she said softly. "I can't believe what's happening. It's like a nightmare." "It is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how things got so bad. I feel like I'm losing everything." Emily reached across the table and took my hand, her grip strong and reassuring. "You're not alone, Jane. We're family, and we'll get through this together." Her words brought a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of my mistakes on my own, but now I realized that I didn't have to face this battle alone. My family was still there for me, even after everything that had happened. "I'm trying to stay strong," I told her, "but it's hard. Every day I feel like I'm drowning." "I know," Emily said, her voice filled with empathy. "But you're stronger than you think. You've been through so much and you're still standing. That's something." We talked for a while longer, and as our conversation drew to a close, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I wasn't ready to give up. I had to keep fighting, not just for myself but for my family as well. As the legal battle continued, my lawyer and I worked tirelessly to counter the prosecution's arguments. We went through every piece of evidence, every email, every document, looking for anything that could exonerate me or at least cast doubt on the charges. But the prosecution was relentless, and it seemed like every time we made progress, they found new ways to undermine our defense. One day, my lawyer called me into a meeting. His expression was serious, and I could tell that he had something important to discuss. "Jane," he began, "I've been talking with the prosecutor, and they've made an offer. It's not what we were hoping for, but it might be your best chance to avoid a longer sentence." My heart raced as I listened, fearing the worst. "What's the offer?" "They're willing to drop the additional charges of conspiracy and wire fraud if you agree to plead guilty to the original charges and cooperate fully with the investigation into Richard. If you do, they'll recommend a sentence reduction, which could mean you serve less time overall." I sat there in stunned silence, weighing the options. Pleading guilty would mean accepting responsibility for crimes I didn't commit, but fighting the charges could lead to an even longer sentence if I lost. It was an impossible choice, and the thought of either option filled me with dread. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me with sympathy. "It's your decision, Jane, but if it were me, I would take the deal. You've been through so much already, and this might be the only way to put this nightmare behind you." I nodded, knowing he was right. The idea of pleading guilty went against everything I believed in, but the thought of spending even more years in prison was unbearable. I had to think about my children, about the chance to rebuild my life once this was all over. "I'll take the deal," I said quietly, the weight of my decision settling over me like a heavy blanket. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings as we finalized the plea agreement. I stood before the judge, my hands trembling as I entered my guilty plea. The words felt foreign and wrong, but I forced myself to say them, knowing it was the only way to secure a future for myself and my family. In exchange for my cooperation, the prosecution agreed to drop the additional charges and recommend a sentence reduction. I knew it wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best outcome I could hope for under the circumstances. As the gavel fell and my plea was accepted, I felt a strange mix of relief and despair. The legal battle was over, but the reality of my situation hadn't changed. I was still facing years in prison, separated from my children, my husband, and everything I held dear. But I was determined to make the best of the situation. I would serve my time, learn from my mistakes, and do whatever it took to rebuild my life. The path to redemption would be long and difficult, but I was ready to face it head-on. As I was led back to my cell, I thought about Tom and the kids, about the future that lay ahead of us. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew that if I could survive this, I could survive anything. I had made terrible mistakes, but I was determined not to let them define me. I would find a way to move forward, to rebuild the trust I had lost, and to prove that I was more than the sum of my past actions. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would fight to reclaim my life and become the person I knew I could be. The daily grind of prison life settled into a routine, each day a repetition of the last. Mornings started early, the harsh clang of metal doors jolting me awake. The days were long, filled with mundane tasks that offered little distraction from the weight of my thoughts. It was a far cry from the life I had known, a life I had taken for granted until it was too late. At first, the isolation was the hardest part. I had lost everything, my freedom, my family, my career, and the loneliness was suffocating. The other inmates kept their distance, sizing me up from afar. I was an outsider, a woman who had fallen from grace, and I quickly learned that trust was a rare commodity in this world. But over time I began to find my footing. I focused on keeping my head down and avoiding trouble, immersing myself in the routine to keep the fear and regret at bay. I signed up for every program available, literacy classes, job training, even therapy sessions, hoping to find some sense of purpose in the midst of the chaos. The therapy sessions were a lifeline. They gave me a chance to confront the choices I had made, to peel back the layers of denial and face the truth about who I had become. I talked about the affair with Richard, the lies I had told, the guilt that consumed me every day. My therapist was patient, guiding me through the process of understanding my actions and the damage they had caused. One day, during a particularly emotional session, I broke down in tears. "I ruined everything," I sobbed, the words spilling out of me uncontrollably. "I had a perfect family, and I destroyed it all for nothing." The therapist nodded, her expression kind but firm. "You made mistakes, Jane, but recognizing those mistakes is the first step toward healing. You can't change the past, but you can work on being better in the future." Her words struck a chord with me. I realized that despite everything I had lost, I still had a chance to rebuild, to find redemption even in the most unlikely of places. I started writing letters to Tom and the kids, pouring my heart onto the page, apologizing for the pain I had caused, and hoping that in time they might find it in their hearts to forgive me. Prison life wasn't easy, and I faced challenges every day. There were moments of fear, when the harsh realities of my surroundings threatened to overwhelm me. But I clung to the hope that this wasn't the end of my story, that one day I would walk out of those prison gates and begin anew. I found small ways to make a difference. I volunteered to help other inmates with their literacy classes, finding solace in teaching them to read and write. It was a small gesture, but it gave me a sense of purpose, a reminder that I still had something to offer, even in the darkest of times. As the months passed, I felt a gradual shift within myself. The anger and despair that had once consumed me began to give way to acceptance. I couldn't undo the past, but I could learn from it. I could use my time in prison to become a better person, someone my children could one day be proud of. And so, I kept going, one day at a time, holding on to the hope that despite everything there was still a future waiting for me. A future where I could rebuild my life piece by piece and find a way back to the family I had lost. As the weeks turned into months, the letters I wrote to Tom and the kids became a lifeline. Every evening after the noise of the day had settled into the quiet hum of the prison, I would sit down with pen and paper and pour my heart out. It was the only way I could stay connected to the life I had left behind, the only way I could try to bridge the chasm my actions had created. I wrote about everything, the mundane details of my days, the thoughts that kept me up at night, and the deep, aching regret that weighed on me constantly. I apologized over and over, not just for the affair, but for the way I had let them down, for the way I had shattered our family. I knew that words couldn't undo the damage I had caused, but they were all I had. For a long time, there was no response. I sent letter after letter, each one a plea for forgiveness, each one met with silence. The waiting was excruciating, but I refused to give up. I had to believe that in time, Tom and the kids might be able to see past the mistakes I had made and remember the woman I had once been, the woman I was trying to become again. Then, one day, a letter arrived for me. The guard handed it to me during mail call, and my hands shook as I tore it open. It was from Tom. My heart raced as I unfolded the paper, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Jane, I've been reading your letters. It's taken me a long time to process everything that's happened, and I'm still not sure where we go from here. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying to move forward, for the kids and for myself. Lily and Max miss you. They ask about you all the time, and it's hard to know what to say. I've told them that you're working on becoming a better person, and I think they're starting to understand that people can make mistakes but still be worthy of love. I can't promise that things will ever go back to the way they were, but I'm willing to try to rebuild some kind of relationship for the sake of the kids. They need their mother, and I need to know that you're serious about making amends. Take care of yourself, Jane. I hope you're finding some peace in all of this. Tom." I read the letter over and over, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't the reconciliation I had longed for, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped me for so long. Tom was willing to try, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. In the weeks that followed, we exchanged more letters. The tone was cautious, guarded, but the fact that Tom was willing to communicate at all was a victory in itself. I treasured every word, clinging to the possibility that, with time, we could rebuild some semblance of the life we had once shared. And then, one day, I received another letter, this time from Lily. It was short, written in the careful handwriting of a 10-year-old, but it was filled with more love than I had felt in months. "Dear Mom, Dad says you're trying to be better, and I'm glad. I miss you a lot. Max misses you too. We talk about you all the time. I hope you can come home soon. Love, Lily." That letter broke something open inside me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. My daughter, my sweet Lily, was reaching out to me, offering a hand that I never thought I would feel again. It was a lifeline, a sign that all was not lost. I wrote back to her immediately, pouring all my love into the letter. I told her how much I missed her, how proud I was of her, and how I was doing everything I could to become the mother she deserved. I promised her that I would keep fighting to be better, for her, for Max, and for our family. The exchange of letters with Tom and the kids became my lifeline. It wasn't easy, and the wounds we had suffered were far from healed. But it was a start. Each letter was a small step toward rebuilding the trust I had shattered, a step toward the future I was determined to create for us. Prison was still a harsh reality, but knowing that my family was willing to give me another chance made it bearable. I knew that I couldn't undo the past, but I could work every day to be the mother, the woman, and the person they needed me to be. And so, I kept writing, kept reaching out, and kept believing that one day, when my time in prison was over, I would walk out of those gates and begin the process of truly rebuilding my relationships and my life with the people who mattered most. The routine of prison life continued, but something within me had changed. The letters from Tom, Lily, and even Max had reignited a spark of hope, and with that hope came a renewed sense of purpose. I was determined not just to serve my time, but to make something meaningful out of it, to become the person my family could be proud of, even from behind bars. I threw myself into the prison programs, taking every opportunity to better myself. I enrolled in educational courses, studied for hours in the prison library, and even began working on earning a degree. The work was challenging, but it gave me a sense of direction, a feeling that I was moving forward, however slowly, toward a future where I could contribute something positive to the world. One of the most impactful experiences came when I started volunteering in a support group for other inmates. The group was small, just a handful of women who, like me, were grappling with the weight of their past mistakes. We shared our stories, our fears, and our hopes for the future. It was in those sessions that I began to truly understand the power of redemption, that it wasn't just about earning forgiveness from others, but about learning to forgive myself. In the group, I met a woman named Carla, who had been in prison for years. She was tough, guarded, and slow to trust, but over time we became close. She had made mistakes of her own, and our conversations often revolved around the idea of starting over, of finding a way to rebuild, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "Why are you helping these women?" Carla asked me one day, her tone skeptical but curious. I paused, considering her question. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost, to believe that you've ruined everything beyond repair. But I also know that as long as we're still breathing, we have a chance to do better." Carla nodded slowly, her expression softening. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to," I replied, my voice steady, "for my kids, for my family, and for myself." As the weeks passed, I found that helping others gave me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. It was as if by helping these women find their own paths to redemption, I was also healing myself. The anger and self-loathing that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the journey. The letters from Tom and the kids continued to arrive, each one a lifeline that kept me grounded. They told me about their lives, about school and soccer games, and about the little moments that made up their days. I treasured every word, knowing that these small connections were helping to rebuild the trust I had shattered. One evening, after a particularly uplifting support group session, I received a letter from Tom that took my breath away. "Jane, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what happens when you get out. The kids and I are doing okay, but they miss you. We all do. I think it's time we start talking about what comes next. I'm not saying everything will be easy, and I'm not sure what our relationship will look like when this is all over. But I'm willing to try. For the kids, and for us. I believe you're changing, and I want to see where this can go. Tom." I read the letter over and over, my heart swelling with a mixture of hope and relief. Tom was willing to give us a chance, to see if we could rebuild our family once I was released. It wasn't a promise of a perfect future, but it was a chance to start over, to make things right. In that moment, I knew that all the work I had been doing, both on myself and with others, wasn't just about surviving prison. It was about preparing for a future where I could truly be the mother, the wife, and the person I wanted to be. The path to redemption was long and challenging, but I was on it, one step at a time. And with every step, I was moving closer to the day when I could finally return to the family I had nearly lost, ready to rebuild our lives together. The day of my release came sooner than I had expected, yet it felt like I had been waiting for it forever. After years behind bars, the idea of stepping back into the world, into my old life, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As I packed my few belongings, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was finally getting a second chance, but I had no idea what awaited me on the other side of those prison gates. I walked out into the sunlight, squinting as my eyes adjusted to the brightness. Tom was there, standing by the car, his expression a mix of apprehension and determination. Seeing him after all this time filled me with a flood of emotions: relief, guilt, hope. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but he broke the silence first. "Jane," he said, his voice steady but cautious, "it's good to see you." I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "It's good to see you too, Tom. Thank you for coming." He gave me a small, tentative smile, and for a brief moment it felt like we were two people meeting for the first time, nervous, unsure, but willing to try. He opened the car door for me, and I slid into the passenger seat, the weight of the past few years hanging heavily between us. The drive home was quiet, filled with the hum of the car engine and the unspoken thoughts that neither of us knew how to voice. I glanced at Tom occasionally, trying to read his expression, but his face was guarded, his eyes focused on the road. When we pulled up to the house, my heart skipped a beat. It looked the same as it always had, but to me, it felt like stepping into a dream, familiar yet distant. Tom turned off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "The kids are inside," he said finally, his voice soft. "They're excited to see you, but they're nervous too. I didn't want to overwhelm them, so I told them we'd take things slow." I swallowed hard, nodding. That's probably for the best. I don't want to rush anything. We walked to the front door together, the silence between us more comfortable now, as if we had silently agreed to take this one step at a time. When the door opened, I was greeted by the sight of Lily and Max standing in the hallway, their faces filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Mom!" Lily cried, rushing forward to hug me. Max followed, his embrace more hesitant but no less heartfelt. Tears welled up in my eyes as I held them close, the reality of being with my children again almost too much to bear. "I've missed you both so much," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "We missed you too," Max said quietly, his small arms wrapped around me. "Dad said you were getting better." I pulled back slightly, looking into his earnest eyes. "I'm trying, Max. I'm trying every day to be better for you and your sister." Lily nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're glad you're home, Mom." The warmth of their acceptance filled me with a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. There would be challenges, awkward moments, and setbacks. But standing there, surrounded by the people I loved most, I knew that we had a chance to rebuild, to create something new out of the broken pieces of our past. Tom stood nearby, watching the reunion with a small, sad smile. When our eyes met, there was an understanding between us, a recognition that this was just the beginning of a long journey. We had a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild, but we were both willing to try. "Why don't we all sit down and have some lunch?" Tom suggested, breaking the tension. "We can talk about what's next and how we're going to do this together." I nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "I'd like that." We spent the afternoon together, talking, laughing, and slowly beginning to reconnect. The years of separation had left their mark, but there were also moments of genuine connection, moments where I saw glimpses of the family we once were and the family we could be again. As the day drew to a close, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was surrounded by love, and that was enough. I had been given a second chance, and I was determined to make the most of it. This was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild my life, my relationships, and my family. And as I looked around the dinner table at Tom, Lily, and Max, I knew that we were all ready to take that journey together, one step at a time. The weeks after my release were a slow and cautious dance as we all adjusted to our new reality. I spent my days trying to re-establish a routine, filling the hours with small tasks that helped me feel connected to my family again. There were moments of joy, like when Max showed me the Lego castle he'd built, or when Lily asked for my help with her homework, and I clung to those moments, knowing they were the building blocks of our future. But there were also moments of discomfort, times when the weight of my past mistakes hung heavy in the air, when the hurt I had caused was palpable. Tom and I were careful around each other, like we were handling something fragile that could shatter at any moment. The affection between us was still there, but it was muted, tinged with the pain of betrayal and the uncertainty of what we could rebuild. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Tom and I sat on the porch together, the cool night air filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hum of the neighborhood. It had become our quiet ritual, these moments of stillness after the long days of navigating our new normal. "I've been thinking," Tom said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness in his tone that made my heart quicken. "We've been through a lot, Jane. More than most couples ever have to face." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, and I knew this conversation had been a long time coming. "I want us to keep trying," he continued, his gaze focused on the dark horizon. "But I think we need to be honest about where we're at. This isn't going to be easy, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to go back to the way things were." The truth of his words stung, but I knew he was right. "I know, Tom. I've been thinking about it too. I don't want to lose what we have left, but I also don't want to pretend that everything's okay when it isn't." He turned to look at me, his eyes softening. "I don't want to pretend either, but I do want to rebuild. Slowly, carefully. I want to see if we can find a new way forward, even if it looks different from what we had before." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I reached for his hand, needing the reassurance of his touch. "I want that too. More than anything, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Tom. I know I hurt you, and I know it's going to take time to heal. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We sat in silence for a while, our hands intertwined as the night wrapped around us like a comforting blanket. In the days that followed, we took things one step at a time. We went on walks together, talked about the future, and slowly began to reintroduce moments of intimacy into our relationship. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance, those days were behind us, but it was something real, something grounded in the shared understanding of what we had been through. I also made a point to focus on my relationship with Lily and Max. We spent time together every day. Whether it was helping them with their schoolwork, playing games, or just sitting and talking about their lives. I wanted them to know that I was fully present, that I was committed to being the mother they needed, even if I had fallen short in the past. One weekend we decided to take a family trip to the beach. It was a simple outing, just a day trip to a nearby shore, but it felt like a milestone, a sign that we were beginning to heal, that we could create new memories together, free from the shadow of the past. The kids ran ahead, laughing as they splashed in the surf, and Tom and I followed at a slower pace, our hands brushing together as we walked along the water's edge. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. "This is nice," Tom said, his voice soft and content. "It feels good, doesn't it?" I nodded, smiling as I watched Lily and Max play. "It does. It really does." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious but tender. "I know we have a long way to go, Jane, but I want you to know that I'm committed to this. To us. I'm willing to put in the work if you are." My heart swelled with emotion, and I reached up to cup his face in my hands. "I'm committed too, Tom. I'm all in. Whatever it takes." He leaned down and kissed me. A slow, gentle kiss that spoke of all the love, pain, and hope we had shared over the years. It wasn't a kiss that erased the past, but it was a kiss that promised a future we were both willing to fight for. As we stood there, the waves lapping at our feet and the sun dipping below the horizon, I knew that our journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear, but there would also be moments of joy and connection, moments like this one, where everything felt right in the world. I had made terrible mistakes, and I had paid a heavy price for them. But I had also been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild my life, to mend the relationships I had broken, and to create something new out of the ashes of the past. And as I looked at Tom, at Lily and Max, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. This was the family I had fought for, the love I had almost lost, and the future I was determined to build. Together we would face whatever came next, one step at a time, hand in hand, with hope in our hearts and a renewed commitment to each other. This was our new beginning, and I was ready to embrace it fully, knowing that no matter what, we were stronger together.